Welcome back and thank you for joining us. This PowerPoint presentation and the accompanying narration was created for East Texas Baptist University for use in the course Criminal Justice 3314, Criminal Investigation. And I am Dr. Eric Hillman. The textbook we're using is Criminal Investigation, 11th edition by Hess, Orthman, and Cho. The student's viewing of this presentation is designed to supplement the reading of the textbook and not simply to replace it. Chapter 6 is entitled Obtaining Information and Intelligence. This is Chapter 6A, the first segment of Chapter 6. There's lots of sources of information, probably innumerable, but we can classify them into three primary sources of information. Those three would be written records. Examples would be reports, databases, and the internet. Second primary source would be victims and witnesses. Sometimes a victim also can be a witness. And the third primary source is the suspects themselves. So let's look at the first category, reports, records, databases, and the internet. Local police records have a lot of information that's not available to the general public. Incident reports are written by police officers. In larger cities, thousands of reports are written per day. Investigation reports may be written as follow-up reports by detectives following up on patrol officer investigations. In some departments, investigation reports are simply additions to the original incident report. Arrest records, often held in the jail or incarceration division, have a lot of information that may not even be in the incident report. MO stands for modus operandi, which is Latin for mode of operation. Many detective divisions have modus operandi files, and this is keeping track of the way that criminals commit crimes so that they can tie several crimes together. If they catch a suspect in one crime with a similar MO, he may be guilty of the other crimes also. Missing persons reports will have information from concerned family members that also may have information. And again, when we talk about all these records and reports, we're not just talking about the specific incident in question that you're looking into, but you're looking historically into all of these reports for past incidents. Because they can help inform you and give you information on this one also. Local police records also include fingerprint files. Nowadays, fingerprint files are done on AFIS, the computer system, and so they're computerized. But for many years, for decades, fingerprint files were kept in written form, where they had card stock, and they would actually physically put ink on the fingertips of the suspects and fingerprint them. So you've got lots of information in old fingerprint files. Lab reports done by the crime lab. Bigger cities like Dallas and Houston will have their own crime labs. Smaller cities will send their data to a private crime lab or to the DPS crime lab. Medical examiner reports. When you go on a murder scene, for instance, you may have several people writing reports. On a murder scene, you may have the police department or sheriff's department homicide investigator writing a report. The first responding officer may be writing a separate report. The medical examiner would show up, and a medical examiner and or his investigator would be writing their own report. If the Texas Rangers show up, they would be writing their own report. So there's lots of different reports that you can refer to. Probation records. When someone is given probation, it means they're found guilty in a court, but the court decides to give them community supervision rather than sending them to jail or to prison. And the probation records sometimes have a lot more complete personal information on the suspects than the police records do. Other law enforcement agencies will usually share their information if you are a certified peace officer, just for the asking. We've talked about local public records. What about local private records? Banks have a lot of information on people. Now keep in mind as we go through this list of private records that many of these entities want to cooperate with the police, but they're afraid of liability. They're afraid of being sued for releasing information. So normally you would be required to get a subpoena, which would be an official legal request from the district attorney's office or the grand jury to get these records. And usually, if a private entity has records on someone else, they will give them to you with a subpoena. If a private entity is asked to give up their own records on their own people or their own business dealings, they will often fight the subpoena and won't give it up until you have an actual court order from the judge. Delivery services, FedEx, UPS, they have a lot of information from different houses in the area. Hospitals will have medical records that may include alcohol use and drug use. Hotels and motels, especially if you have a third-party relationship, may have some interesting information. Newspapers, newspaper reporters sometimes will cooperate with the police and sometimes they won't. As you recall, they are protected by the First Amendment. Sometimes to get information from newspapers, you may actually have to get a court order. Telephone directories, mostly online now, but in the old days you could find a lot of information just by looking through the paper telephone directory that your grandmother probably still uses. Utilities. Everyone needs electricity or wants it, and so utilities have information on sometimes who's staying there, whose name the house is in, how long they've been there, their prior address and utility record, etc. Pawnbrokers. When someone takes an item to a pawn shop, the pawn shop is required to get identification from the person in the form of a Texas driver's license or Texas state ID or other government ID. And so pawn shops have a lot of information on people, especially since a significant portion of items going through pawn shops are stolen. Storage companies, you store it. They have information on who's storing it, what may be in there, how long it's been in there, who's paying for the storage, etc. Schools have lots of information on students, and in turn, therefore, have information on their parents. So good sources of information for, say, drugs in school, child abuse cases, etc. Taxi companies keep records of who they pick up and when and where, and who called in from what number. Often they can tie that into a crime. Cell phone records. Some companies keep records of every call that goes out and comes in and sends them to the people that have the cell phone. Other times they simply charge them a monthly fee for the service, and yet their computers have the data in there. Each cell company will keep that information a certain amount of time. There's an incredible amount of information available if you send a subpoena to a cell phone company. We talked about local government records. There's also state government records. The Department of Public Safety is the main source of information for criminal records. The Department of Motor Vehicles will give you lots of information on motor vehicles based on license plates or VINs. A VIN is a vehicle identification number. That's the serial number that you'll find underneath the or on the driver's side dashboard and in the door frame on the driver's side door. Texas Department of Criminal Justice, formerly known as TDC, Texas Department of Corrections, they are the ones that run the prison system and the parole system. So in the prisons they have something called a pen packet. A pen packet is the complete criminal history of everyone who's ever been in prison, and it's all in one place. So your local police department may only have the local information, but the pen packet in the prison, it tends to be very, very complete. If someone gets out of prison early, they go on parole, and the parole officers also have a lot of information. Unfortunately, there isn't as much communication between police and sheriffs and probation and parole, but there should be more, because both probation and parole have a lot of information that they can offer to police officers and sheriff's department employees. Texas Department of Insurance, not what you typically think of as a criminal justice agency, but they are in charge of investigating arsons. Arson is a crime, of course, and insurance fraud, so they have a lot of information too. The federal government also has records. The FBI, being the main federal criminal justice agency, runs the three main computers that you're going to use in police work. NCIC, National Crime Information Center. They're going to have criminal history information and information on stolen items. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, has DNA information. And IAFIS, the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, has fingerprint information for you. Some FBI files they are very secretive with, especially on terrorism. They don't want any leaks, but these three computer databases are generally speaking available to all law enforcement at all levels. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives has the NIBIN database, National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. They also willingly share this with local law enforcement agencies. This is ballistics, the study of bullets, shell casings, the striations, which are the small marks on the bullets and shell casings, and they're willing to work with you to try to match up bullets and shell casings from unsolved crimes. The Department of Homeland Security has many sub-agencies, including CBP and ICE. The U.S. Marshals look for fugitives. We know that USPS stands for United States Postal Service, but if you add a letter I in there, that's the United States Postal Inspection Service, and they are the police of the post office. So if you have mail fraud, that is often investigated by the USPIS, United States Postal Inspection Service. One problem that you run into with some of these government agencies is that they don't feel like they have to honor state subpoenas. And so you try to get them to cooperate with you voluntarily. If not, you may have to go to federal court to get a subpoena for their information. Well, your generation is the first to grow up completely with the internet. We all know Google. That's probably the #1 search that people know about. When you're looking for suspects or witnesses, you can look on Facebook. Sometimes you can identify witnesses or suspects based on the victim's Facebook page. Sometimes the suspects themselves are stupid enough to post pictures of themselves with, say, a gun and money that they got from a robbery. Maybe they're high, maybe they're drunk, maybe they're just stupid. But amazing the number of people who get on Facebook and pose with the proceeds of the crime. The IACP is the International Association of Chiefs of Police. That's their website. They have a lot of information specifically in training police officers, including investigators. There are several background check sites. Police departments obviously can do background checks, but only for a police purpose. And police department background checks are normally only criminal in nature. If you pay a little bit of money to a private background check site, you can get all kinds of family history, address history, credit history, etc. from your suspects. There's thousands of sites with information. It's, I mentioned these few, but I'm barely touching what's available on the internet. The second category is victims, witnesses, complainants, and reportees. Keep in mind as you talk to people that no one is legally required to cooperate with the police except to give basic identification. If they are stopped and detained, they have to give their name and date of birth, but beyond that they don't have to cooperate. So when you're talking to this category, you normally want to try to voluntarily elicit cooperation. What do we mean by victim? Well, a victim is a person who's injured by a crime. It doesn't have to be a physical injury. It could be, when we say injured in a legal sense, it just means you suffered some harm. So it could be physical harm, or it simply could be loss. If someone steals your car when you're not even there, you're still injured by the crime. You suffered a loss. A victim is sometimes thought of as someone different than a witness, but in legal jargon, a victim is a complaining witness. So even if the victim did not see the car getting stolen, for instance, they go into the restaurant, they eat, they come out, their car is gone, they're still a victim and they're still considered a complaining witness. They can testify to something. They can testify to the fact that they parked their car there, which makes them a witness, and they're the complaining witness because they suffered harm. Definition of a witness is a person who saw a crime or has knowledge of crime. That's pretty simple. A complainant, and you'll see this in police terminology. I never saw the word complainant until I became a police officer. A person requesting police action. A reportee is a person who reports a crime. So if someone sees a crime and calls 911 and says, hey, this lady's getting her purse stolen across the street, that person would be both a witness because they saw the crime and a reportee because they reported the crime. Keep in mind that victims are often angry. They're at being a victim. They're emotional. They're afraid. Sometimes they don't want to cooperate with you. So your people skills come into play here. Sometimes witnesses and victims will exaggerate or distort. It may be intentional or it could be subconscious. You don't know. Be very slow to accuse a witness or victim of lying. You may determine that later, but accept it at face value for now. Sometimes a victim will give you a dying declaration. So if this guy is dying or believes he's dying and he wants to make a statement about the crime, then normally if he says, and we said, who did this to you? And he says, well, it was a white male, 6 feet, 215 pounds, short hair, clean shaven. Normally, since this person is a victim, he would be required to go to court and say that. The police officer couldn't say, oh yeah, I saw the victim and the victim told me this. The police could not testify because that would be hearsay. But when the person is dying and they make the declaration dying or believing they're dying, that becomes a dying declaration, and that's admissible even over hearsay objections. Eyewitness testimony is very important. It's a key to many convictions. The problem is eyewitness testimony is not always reliable. There's a group called the Innocence Project, which is a nationwide group, but they have an affiliate called the Innocence Project of Texas, and they've done a study of wrongful convictions, and they have discovered that the top reason for wrongful convictions is mistaken eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses who think they're right, but they're not. So when you are talking to a witness, you got to be careful about encouraging the witnesses to be too confident. If the witness is not sure, then accept the witness at face value. They're not sure. The problem is if you encourage the witness to be confident, yes, I know for sure. Well, if the witness doesn't know for sure and you encourage them, then they're going to take your lead because you're a police officer. You know how things work. So if she says, as you bring a suspect by, is this the man that stole your purse? Well, I'm not sure. And some officers who, with questionable ethics, would say, ma'am, if you say it's not him, we got to let him go. Do you want him to rob somebody else too? You don't want that on your conscience, do you? No, I don't. Yeah, I guess it's him. Well, she is playing along with the game because she believes the police could not possibly be wrong. They must have the right guy, and she doesn't want to be guilty of letting a criminal go. And by the time she goes to court, she's so confident that she will swear and believe it and pass a lie detector test that this is the guy that stole her purse, when the reality is she wasn't sure. And so if she's not sure, let her be not sure. People will report what they saw, yes, but sometimes what that includes what they expected to see, what they wanted to see, and what they actually saw. We are often victims of crime when we're under stress, and being victims of crime is stressful. The human mind psychologically wants to fill in missing blanks. Can't remember how tall he was, can't remember if he had a mustache, can't remember what color pants he had on. Sometimes your mind will just fill it in for you. And even though your mind is only guessing, your mind naturally wants a complete picture, and so it tries to fill one in for you. And then after you tell your friends that story of what happened, oh, I heard you got robbed, what happened? And she tells that story 4 or 5 times. By the time she comes to court, she's absolutely sure that that's what happened. And people can convince themselves of things that they weren't originally sure of based on this idea of filling in the missing blanks. Some witnesses, of course, may not want to get involved. Someone hears a noise outside and looks outside through the windows and he sees a crime out there. Why doesn't he want to get involved? Well, maybe he knows the suspect. Suspect's part of a gang. I don't want the gang harassing me, so I'm not going to get involved. Maybe he's afraid of being called a snitch. There's a saying in the inner city, snitches end up in ditches needing stitches. Well, what is a snitch really? A snitch is someone who tells the truth and helps crime victims. So why are people so afraid of the snitch label? If someone is a crime victim, help them. Sometimes people withhold information because they don't have clean hands. What do we mean by unclean hands? Well, some guy goes down to the red light district and he picks up a prostitute. And he sleeps with her, and then she robs him. He takes out his wallet to give her $20, $40, and she sees he's got several $100s in there, and she robs him. She pulls out a knife or a gun, takes his wallet, and goes off running. Then he calls the police. Why? Because if it was just money, he might not. He doesn't want to get caught in this situation, but she's got his ID, she's got his credit cards, he's got to make a report. So when he calls you, he'll say something like, yeah, I just pulled over the side of the road to make a phone call, and this lady came up and knocked on the door. I thought she might need a ride or need directions, and she robbed me. And he'll completely leave out the part of, yeah, they went in the hotel room together and did the nasty deed. So people who don't have clean hands, they will withhold information from you. Sometimes you gotta dig for it. Sometimes you have to make an effort to locate witnesses. Witnesses may not stand around and wait for the police to get there. First of all, if they see lots of other witnesses, they might think, oh, police don't need to talk to me. There's 20 witnesses out here, especially when a crowd has gathered after, for instance, a motor vehicle accident. Sometimes they don't want to have their friends or neighbors see them talk to the police because they don't want to be considered a snitch. So sometimes you have to go locate those witnesses. One way you do that is through a neighborhood canvas. Now see, this word canvas has 2 S's. Canvas with 1 S is like the canvas that you paint on, or the canvas that you make a tent out of. But canvas with 2 S's means that you are going door to door, knocking on doors, and finding out, did anyone see what happened out here last night? Certainly you can ask the victim if they saw anyone else, or if they know who lives in a certain house, if that person friendly, is that person also a gang member, etc. You can check on social media. because sometimes people will say on social media, oh man, you wouldn't believe what I saw last night. No, they won't tell the police that, but they'll get on Facebook or Twitter or something and they'll blast their mouth. So check on social media. You might find things. Maybe you don't have their passwords, but maybe your victim does, or maybe another witness does, has access to what they're saying. You can make public appeals for serious crimes like murders. The TV stations and radio stations will ask for witnesses, maybe put on a video of a suspect, etc. You can post flyers in the neighborhood to try to encourage people to call the police with any information they have. You can even do informational checkpoints where you stop everyone going down the street and simply ask them, we're investigating crime. Did you see what happened here Friday night at 6:30? Did you see the accident that happened here? Or did you know anything about what happened at the 7-Eleven at 11 p.m. Friday night? You can do a knock and talk for both witnesses and suspects. That simply means you're knocking on the door, and you usually do this to surprise them. You don't call ahead. And you talk to, especially for suspects, as long as it's voluntary and they're not in custody, you can do this. If they're charged with a crime, you can't talk to them without their lawyer being present. Because a knock and talk is consensual, it doesn't violate the Fourth Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment is violation of a reasonable expectation of privacy. If they voluntarily come to the door, it's consensual. If they're not in custody, then you don't need to read Miranda. Now, they do have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. You have to honor that if they choose to remain silent. And they have a Sixth Amendment right to counsel. So if they've already been charged, you can't then go back to their house and ask them more questions, because once they're charged, they have a Sixth Amendment right to counsel. Some police officers use informants. Basically, an informant is simply a person with information about a crime. Informants are not victims, witnesses, complainants, or suspects. Informants are perhaps people who live in the criminal underworld, or someone who goes into that undercover, who's not a police officer, to gain information. Sometimes simply an interested citizen. Somebody in the neighborhood's tired of the drug dealers, tired of the crime, tired of the burglaries, and they start asking around to see what's going on, and they pass that information on to the police. Sometimes informants are criminals themselves, and they want money or a plea bargain. So this criminal lives in this neighborhood, he knows what's going on, he knows who the other criminals are, he knows who the drug dealers are, and he finds that information and he says, hey, you know, for if you get me some money, I'll give you some information. Or, hey, you know, I've got a drug case myself. If you give me probation instead of jail time on my drug case, then I'll get some information on this murder case, this robbery case, etc. A confidential informant is otherwise known as a CI. A confidential informant wants their name to stay hidden. And in fact, it can stay hidden unless they're called upon to testify in court. Once they testify in court, their identity has to be revealed. But prior to that time, you can hide their information. A confidential informant will be registered with the police department and will be assigned an ID number. So each confidential informant that works for the police department has to be registered. Confidential informants are compensated by the police in the form of either money or better deals on plea bargains. Very often, and probably most common use of confidential informants is for undercover drug buys. Sometimes the police will arrest someone, and maybe it's their second or third arrest or a felony arrest. They're looking at 2 to 20 years, and the police will say, well, we'll give you probation, or we'll give you 2 years instead of 20 if you can arrange some undercover drug buys. And although normally this type of person would not turn on their friends or their acquaintances, if they're looking at 20 years in jail, yeah, they will. When you use a confidential informant to get an arrest warrant, you've got to say in your affidavit, that's what you swear to the judge, you've got to show that the confidential informant is reliable. So on your affidavit, you have to say things like, confidential informant number 6042 was used on 4 prior occasions, and on each of those occasions, the information proved to be correct, and the police were able to make a narcotics trafficking arrest. That'd be an example of how you prove to the judge that a confidential informant is reliable. And again, their name can stay confidential unless they have to testify in court. If they have to testify in court, both the court, the judge, and the criminal defendant have a right to know their name. And the third category is suspects. When you do talk to a suspicious person or a suspect, in the old days we used to say you'd complete a field interview card. These were actually physical cards, like 3x5 or 5x7 cards, documenting talking to a suspect. Now most of that is done online or with the police computer system, so the physical cards aren't used so often anymore. But what this is a record of a certain person or a certain vehicle at a specific place or a specific time. So you may see a suspicious vehicle and you can't tie it into any crime, but still the police department computer system has a way for you to enter this information in, and then 3 days later they found out that the guy on the corner who's been out of town for 2 weeks had his house broken into, and they're able to tie it in because you simply made an entry, hey, there was a suspicious vehicle parked on this corner at this time. Also, if you happen to talk to them, they're going to tell you a story as to why they were there. So, hey, what you doing? Oh, I'm just waiting on my brother-in-law. He's getting off work. He's going to pick me up. Right here? Yeah, we meet here often because we used to hang out here. You know, whatever he makes up. Well, you write that down and it's in the record. Then when he's arrested several weeks later for some kind of crime and he tells that officer a different story, now you can show that he's lying. And often these are really just tidbits of information. You don't have the complete story. If you had the complete story and the complete information and the complete crime, you'd write a whole incident report and you make an arrest. But you're basically recording these tidbits of information that seem suspicious to you, but at the time you can't tie them to a crime. Often those can be used later to solve crimes. Again, remember, if you talk to a suspect who's in custody, you have to read him his Miranda warnings, his right to remain silent, right to an attorney, right to terminate the interview. But that's only if he's in custody. If this is a voluntary encounter where you're just talking to him on the street, he's not in custody and you don't have to read Miranda. We talk a lot more about that in the Courts and Criminal Procedure class. And that is the end of Chapter 6A. Once you review this presentation and take notes, you can go on to Chapter 6B. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.